She stood at the altar in a borrowed dress, holding wildflowers she'd picked herself because there was no money left for anything else. And the church was full, the candles were lit, and every soul in Broken Hollow had come to watch Clara Wren finally catch a break. Then the door opened, and it wasn't him. It was a boy, 13 years old, maybe 14, with dirt on his boots and a folded letter pinched between two fingers like it was something he'd been paid to deliver, because he had been. If you've ever watched someone's entire life collapse in the span of 30 seconds, then you already know what happened next. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what came after that letter was something no one in that town ever forgot. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and follow along, because what Clara does next will surprise you. The morning of Clara Wren's wedding started the way most things in her life had started lately, with something going slightly wrong. She'd been awake since before 4. Not from nerves exactly, though there were plenty of those humming beneath her ribs. She'd been awake because the hem of her dress had come loose in the night, and she'd spent the last dark hour before sunrise sitting cross-legged on the floor of her rented room above the feed store, squinting at ivory fabric in the weak light of a single tallow candle, trying to make stitches small enough that nobody would notice. Her hands were not made for fine needlework. They were beekeeper's hands, broad across the palm, strong in the fingers, rough in a way that no amount of lard and rosewater could fully soften. Her father had always called them working hands, the way other men called things good bones, meaning the surface wasn't much, but the foundation was sound. She missed her father. She pushed that thought away before it could sink its teeth in and finished the hem by feel more than by sight, biting off the thread and smoothing the fabric down with her palm. There. Good enough. That was sort of her philosophy about most things these days. Good enough. Keep moving. Don't look too long at what's broken, or you'll lose your nerve. The room above the feed store had been her home for 3 months, ever since the Halverson brothers had come with their papers and their flat practiced sympathy and taken possession of the apiary, her father's apiary, the place she'd grown up in, learned in, loved in, 42 hives arranged along a south-facing slope, generations of carefully bred colonies, a smokehouse, a small extracting shed that smelled permanently of wax and clover. Gone. Her father had borrowed against it the winter before he got sick. She hadn't known how much until after he was buried and the bank sent their man around. By then there was nothing to argue about. The debt was real. The papers were real. The fact that Walter Wren had spent 30 years building that apiary with his own hands, and that his daughter had spent 23 years working it alongside him, didn't enter into it. So she'd packed what she could carry, taken the room above the feed store, and said yes when Gavin Mercer asked her to marry him. She hadn't been naive about it. She wanted to be clear on that point, at least to herself. She wasn't a girl anymore, spinning fantasies about love and candlelit kitchens. She was a woman of 23 with calloused hands and no property, in a territory where a woman without property had very few good options and a long list of bad ones. Gavin Mercer was the son of the territory's most successful grain broker. He was handsome in that square-jawed, well-fed way that frontier prosperity tended to produce. He was reasonably kind, at least in public, and he had shown enough interest in her specifically, in the beekeeper's daughter, not just any available woman, that she'd let herself believe it might be something real. More than that, she had told herself, she could make it real. She was good at making things work with insufficient materials. She'd been doing it her whole life. The church filled up faster than she expected. She watched from behind the curtain of the small anteroom off the nave, peeking through the gap like a child, tracking faces as they came through the heavy oak doors. Half of Broken Hollow was there. The Delaney family in their Sunday best, Ruth Perkins, who ran the laundry, old Cabe Stanton, who'd been a trapper, and now just seemed to drift between establishments looking for conversation, the Mercer family's various cousins and business associates arranged in the front pews like a declaration of territory. Standing beside her, attempting to adjust the veil that kept slipping, was her only real friend in town, a woman named May Tuttle, who ran the dry goods counter at Patterson's and had sharp opinions about everything and kept most of them to herself, which made the ones she voiced feel like weather reports. "You look fine," May said, not quite managing to sound like she meant it. "The hem held." "The hem is fine. Stand still." "I'm standing still." You're vibrating like a fence post in a windstorm. Clara turned away from the curtain gap. How many people are out there? Enough. May. A lot of people, Clara. The whole town, practically. I think some of them came because they're hoping something interesting will happen. That's a terrible thing to say before someone's wedding. Is it wrong, though? Clara looked at her for a moment, and then, despite herself, she laughed. A small, slightly panicked sound. No, she admitted. Probably not. May smoothed the veil one final time and stepped back to look at her with the assessing expression of a woman who understood that honesty and kindness were not always the same thing. You look like your mother probably did, she said finally. Your father used to say she was the most stubborn, beautiful thing he'd ever seen. That landed somewhere soft. Clara pressed her lips together and nodded. Let's get this done, she said. She waited. The organist played. Someone coughed. The candles on the altar threw soft light across the faces of the congregation. Through the walls of the church came the faint sounds of the town going about its business. A wagon on the packed earth street, a dog somewhere, the distant rhythmic clang of the blacksmith, who did not take Sundays off on principle. She waited some more. The organist circled back through the opening hymn a second time, a little slower, the way you repeat yourself when you're hoping someone will answer. May came to stand beside her in the doorway between the anteroom and the nave. Neither of them said anything for a while. 10 minutes past the hour, then 15. Maybe his horse threw a shoe, said May. Maybe, said Clara, or the road out from his father's place was muddier than they thought. May. What? You don't have to do that. A short pause. No, May agreed. I suppose I don't. 20 minutes. The murmuring in the pews had grown from a low hum to something more pointed. Clara could feel the shift in the air the way you can feel weather coming. That particular charge of collective attention turning toward her, all those eyes and mouths and opinions, all that hunger for a story. She made herself breathe slowly. She made herself stand up straight. She looked at the altar and the candles and the empty place at the front of the aisle where Gavin Mercer was supposed to be standing, and she thought, well, here we are. The doors opened. She heard the sound before she processed what it meant. The oak doors swinging inward on their hinges, that particular wooden groan, and then footsteps. One set of footsteps, small ones. She came out of the anteroom. The boy was maybe 13 or 14, difficult to pin down precisely because he was the kind of kid who looked like he'd been working hard since he was 8, and it had compressed whatever softness childhood was supposed to leave in a person's face. He wore a jacket too large for him, and boots caked with road dirt. He stood in the center aisle with the letter held out in front of him, turning it slightly in his fingers as he scanned the assembled faces, looking for someone who matched whatever description he'd been given. His eyes landed on her. Something in his expression flickered. Not guilt, exactly. He was too young to own guilt about someone else's errand, but something. Some recognition of the gap between what he'd been paid to deliver and what the delivery meant. He walked up the aisle toward her. The church had gone absolutely silent. Not the held-breath silence of anticipation, but the hollow silence of something collapsing. All that murmur and shuffling and rustling simply extinguished. Every person in those pews suddenly aware that they were witnesses to something they hadn't come to see. The boy stopped in front of Clara. "You're Miss Wren," he said. His voice hadn't broken yet. It came out high and careful. "I am," she said. He held out the letter. She took it. He said, "The man who gave it to me said to tell you he was sorry." And then he looked like he immediately wished he hadn't said it, because the sound that went through the congregation at those words was not quite a gasp, but was not quite silence either. It was something in between, that collective exhale of a crowd that has just realized what kind of story they are inside. Clara looked down at the letter in her hands. Her name on the front in Gavin Mercer's handwriting. That slightly too neat script of a man who'd had just enough schooling to be proud of his penmanship. She didn't open it right there. Later she would think about that choice and not be entirely sure why she made it. Some instinct for preservation, maybe. Some understanding, animal and wordless, that whatever was in that letter needed to be read in private or not at all. That letting this crowd watch her face while she read it would be a kind of surrender she couldn't afford. She turned and walked back into the anteroom. May followed her and pulled the curtain closed behind them. In the dim light of that small room, with the candle May held throwing unsteady shadows across the walls, Clara broke the seal and unfolded the paper. 5 sentences. She read them once quickly, then again slowly. Then she stood very still for a moment with the letter held against her chest and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. May said nothing. She had enough sense to know when silence was the only thing that fit. The letter said, in brief and mercilessly neat handwriting, that Gavin Mercer had decided to pursue a match with Eleanor Forsyth of Junction City, whose father owned 3 grain elevators and whose dowry was, as he put it, more fitting to my family's circumstances and future plans. He hoped Clara would understand that these things were decided by practical considerations. He wished her well. He was sorry for any inconvenience. Inconvenience. She lowered the letter. "He's not coming," she said. Her own voice surprised her. How steady it sounded, how flat. May's jaw tightened. Clara sits. He found someone with more money. She folded the letter along its original crease. Her hands were completely still. He sent a boy. May said something then, low and emphatic, that Clara would not repeat in polite company, and under different circumstances it might have made her laugh. Instead, she just folded the letter again into quarters, into eighths, as small as she could make it, and put it in the pocket of her dress. "I have to go back out there," she said. "You don't have to do anything. Those people are sitting in those pews. Clara, you don't owe those people a single thing." She looked at May for a moment, at the anger on her behalf that May was holding barely in check, the fierce protectiveness of it, the particular way genuine friendship looks when it's put to the test. She was grateful for it. She stored it away somewhere she could find it later, when she had time to feel things properly. "I know," she said, "but I'm going out there anyway." She walked back through the curtain. Every face in the church turned toward her, and she let them turn. She stood at the top of the aisle in her borrowed dress with the loose hem she'd fixed herself in the pre-dawn dark, holding the wildflowers she'd picked from the roadside because they were free, and she met the eyes of the congregation without flinching. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the boy's errand hadn't already said. She walked down the aisle. The Mercer family cousins in the front pews had the decency to look at their hands. Old Cabe Stanton, who had survived 30 years of trapping and had a trapper's fundamental honesty about the nature of things, met her eyes as she passed and gave her a single slow nod, the kind that meant, "I see you," and nothing more or less than that. Ruth Perkins from the laundry was crying. Clara noticed this distantly and thought that Ruth was perhaps crying for herself as much as for Clara, that kind of weeping that attaches to a stranger's disaster because it rhymes with something private. She pushed open the oak doors. Outside, Broken Hollow went on exactly as it had. The wagon traffic, the blacksmith's steady rhythm, the dog that was apparently just always barking somewhere, indifferent to what had just happened inside the church, the way the world always is, the way it keeps moving beneath the feet of people who feel like they've stopped. She walked. She didn't go back to the room above the feed store. She couldn't explain it precisely. She just knew she couldn't be in that small room, with its single window and its smell of grain dust, with the rest of this day pressing down on her. She needed to be somewhere that was not a place she'd retreated to, not a place that already carried the weight of defeat. So she walked, out the north end of town, past the livery and the tanner's yard and the last of the buildings, out onto the road that ran between fields that hadn't fully greened yet. It was early enough in spring that the world still looked like it was making up its mind. The dress caught on the road dirt, and the hem she'd fixed started pulling loose at one end, and she didn't stop to fix it. She just walked, faster than was strictly sensible in wedding shoes, one hand pressed flat against her pocket where the folded letter was, as if it might escape. She walked until the town was completely out of sight. She walked until her feet said enough, and her lungs said, "You're not as calm as you think you are." And she found herself sitting down on a flat rock at the edge of the road beside a stretch of untended fence line. Not because she'd chosen to sit, but because her legs had simply decided. The dress settled around her in the dust. She took the letter out of her pocket. She unfolded it. She read it one more time, all 5 sentences, and this time she let herself actually feel what she was reading. Let it land properly. Let the weight of it come down. He had taken her seriously enough to court her. had dinner with her father twice before her father died, had held her hand at the funeral, had waited 4 months, then asked. And this whole time, whatever she had been to him, practicality, convenience, a placeholder against a better option, he had looked her in the face and let her believe otherwise. Let her put in 3 months at the feed store making plans. Let her alter the dress, pick the flowers, stand at the altar. And then sent a boy. She stared at the letter for a long time. Then she crumpled it, one deliberate fist, crushing it as small as it would go, and held it balled in her palm. The sound she made then was not crying exactly. It was more like something structural giving way, the kind of sound a building makes before it falls. One low, involuntary noise, and then nothing. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She had lost her father. She had lost the apiary. She had lost the only plan she'd had for surviving both of those losses. She was sitting in the dust beside the road in a dress she'd borrowed and wildflowers that were already going limp, and she was 23 years old, and for the first time since her father died, she could not see a single thing in front of her. She didn't hear the wagon coming, or rather, she heard it and didn't register it, the sound of a horse on the road, the particular creak and groan of a working wagon, the way you don't hear ambient sound when your mind is somewhere else entirely. It was only when it stopped that she looked up. The man sitting in the wagon seat was perhaps 15 years older than her, lean in the way of people who work outdoors, with the kind of face that's been weathered not just by sun, but by time passing and some of it going wrong. Dark hair going to gray at the temples. He held the reins loosely, with the easy posture of someone who drives this road often. He was not looking at her with pity. That registered first before anything else. Most people who encountered a woman sitting alone in the road in a wedding dress would look at her with some version of pity, even the well-meaning ones, especially the well-meaning ones. He wasn't doing that. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you're trying to understand it without jumping to conclusions. He said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. Her voice came out scraped-sounding. "Just sitting." He looked at the dress, at the wildflowers she still held in one hand without realizing it, at the crumpled letter in her other fist. He didn't say the thing most people would have said, which was some version of what happened to you. Instead, he said, "Have you eaten today?" She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected. What? Eaten. Food. Today. She had to actually think about it. She'd had coffee before 5 in the morning and half a biscuit that May had brought, and that was most of a day ago, it felt like. "Not really," she said. He reached behind the wagon seat and produced a cloth-wrapped bundle, which he set on the seat beside him. He unwrapped it without ceremony. 2 pieces of cornbread, a wedge of hard cheese. "Traveling food," he said. "Not much, but it's something." She stared at the cornbread. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "My name's Elias Rowan. I have the orchard about 2 miles up the road." She knew the orchard. Everyone in the territory knew it, vaguely. The Rowan place, the old apple spread that used to be something and wasn't anymore. "The one that doesn't produce," she said, before she could stop herself. Something moved in his face, not offense exactly, but a flash of something. Recognition, maybe. "That's the one," he said. An awkward beat. "I'm sorry," she said. I'm not usually—" She stopped. She was sitting in a ditch in a wedding dress. The social courtesies of the situation were unclear. "You're Clara Wren," he said. "Walter Wren's daughter." She went still. "You knew my father?" "Not well. I bought a queen from him once, years ago. Tried to keep a few hives." He paused. "I was terrible at it. She absconded in the second spring." He said this without apparent embarrassment, just a plain accounting of failure. I was sorry to hear he passed. She looked down at her lap. The crumpled letter. The wilting flowers. "Thank you." A silence settled between them, but it was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that happens when 2 people are each deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. Elias Rowan said, "I don't suppose you're in a hurry to get somewhere." She let out a short, involuntary breath, almost a laugh. "No," she said, "I'm not." "Then let me ask you something, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you like." She waited. "Your father was the finest beekeeper in 3 counties," he said.
Everybody knew it. And you worked that operation alongside him for, what, since you were a girl? Since I was 6, she said, pulling wax moths. I graduated to hive inspections when I was 9. He nodded slowly. Then you know what I don't. And I have land that's going nowhere without what you know. He shifted the reins to one hand, the casual economy of long habit. I'm not asking about today. I'm not asking you to decide anything sitting in the dirt beside the road in that dress. But I want to ask, when you're ready to hear it, whether you'd consider coming out to look at my land. She looked at him for a long moment. Just look at it, he said. No obligations. See if it's worth anything. She thought about the room above the feed store. She thought about the letter in her fist. She thought about what the next 6 months looked like, and then the 6 after that, in a territory where her options were narrowing in ways that felt like walls being built around her, one season at a time. She thought about her father's hands, demonstrating the right way to lift a frame. She thought about the sound of 42 hives in summer, that deep collective hum that was somehow both busy and peaceful at once, and how she hadn't heard it in 3 months, and the absence of it sat in her chest like a stone. She unfolded the crumpled letter. She looked at Gavin Mercer's neat handwriting one last time. Then she folded it again cleanly and put it back in her pocket. Not because she wanted to keep it, because she was not done with what it meant yet, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. All right, she said. When I'm ready. He offered her the cornbread. She took it. She did not go back to town that afternoon. She sat on that rock beside the road for a long time after his wagon disappeared around the bend, eating cornbread and cheese and watching the afternoon light move across the ungreened fields. The dress was a lost cause, the hem fully separated on one side now, road dust ground into the fabric, a small tear at the knee she didn't remember getting. She would have to return it. She would have to face the town. She would have to collect her things from the feed store room and explain to the owner that she'd be paying next month's rent. She was almost certain she could. She had a little money saved, not much. And she would have to walk down the main street of Broken Hollow, knowing that every window and every doorway held someone who had watched what happened in that church. That would be tomorrow's problem. Right now, she sat in the last of the afternoon light and let herself feel what she felt. Not the flat, shocked numbness of the church, but the real thing underneath it, the grief and the humiliation and the anger, and beneath all of those, like a floor you find when you've broken through everything above it, the oldest loss of all, her father, gone, and the apiary gone with him, and the life she'd thought she was building collapsing long before today had finished the job. She let herself sit with all of it. She did not try to talk herself into being fine. She was not fine. She was a 23-year-old woman with a beekeeper's hands and no hives, sitting in a ruined borrowed dress at the edge of a road that didn't lead anywhere obvious, holding wildflowers that were now more or less completely dead. She was not fine, but she was still here. And somewhere up the road, 2 miles give or take, there was a broken orchard that hadn't produced in 7 years. And she knew things about broken things. She got up, eventually, when the light was going orange, and the air had taken on that particular edge of early spring evenings, still cold enough to remind you that winter wasn't really done, just resting. She picked up her dead wildflowers. She started walking, not back to town, not yet. She walked north, up the road, just far enough to see the tree line where the rowan orchard began. Row after row of apple trees in the early stages of leafing out, bare branches filling in slowly, the whole place slightly overgrown and absolutely silent. She stood at the edge of it in the failing light. She looked at those trees. There were no bees anywhere. She already knew that, just from looking. You could tell a beeless orchard by a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with wind. A silence in the blossoms that shouldn't be silence, should be humming and movement and the constant small industry of pollinators. This place had none of that. It was just trees going through the motions of blooming for no one. She stood there for a long time. Okay, she said, to the trees, to the empty air, to herself. Then she turned around and walked back toward town. She had a ruined dress to return. She had a small room to face. She had a town full of people who'd watched the worst morning of her life and would have opinions about it. She walked toward all of it. She was still walking. That, for now, was enough. The town talked about it for 2 weeks straight. Clara had expected that. She'd have been a fool not to.
Broken Hollow was not a large place. Maybe 400 souls in the town proper, another few hundred scattered across the surrounding farms and homesteads, and 400 souls with nothing particularly dramatic happening that spring had latched onto the story of the Wren girl and the letter like a dog onto a boot heel. She heard versions of it walking past the dry goods store, caught the tail end of it through the open window of the barber shop, saw it in the way certain women from the Mercer family's social circle found somewhere else to look when she passed them on the street.
She let it talk. What she didn't let it do was change what she ate for breakfast, how she walked, or what she decided to do with her mornings. She'd gone to see May the day after the wedding that wasn't, still in the cleaned-up remnants of her ordinary clothes, because she'd returned the borrowed dress folded in brown paper without speaking to anyone about it. May had made coffee strong enough to strip paint and sat across from her at the small table behind the dry goods counter and said, "What do you need?" "Not are you all right? Not what a terrible thing. Just what do you need?" "Work," Clara said. "Real work, not counterwork." May looked at her steadily. "Rowan's place," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know it?" "Everybody knows it. 7 years of bad harvests." May turned her coffee cup in both hands. "They also know Elias Rowan. He's not a bad man. He keeps to himself. Took over the orchard from his father, and the orchard hasn't cooperated since." She paused. "People think he's cursed." "People think a lot of things," Clara said. "They do," May agreed. "You going out there?" "He asked me to look at the land." "And?" Clara thought about those silent trees and the failing light, that wrong kind of quiet. "And I think I know what's missing." May was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Clara, you know what people will say? Woman, alone, working on a man's property." "I know." "It'll add to the talking." "May." Clara set down her cup. "They're already talking. I can either sit in that room above the feed store and wait for it to stop, or I can go do something useful." She looked at her hands on the table. The beekeeper's hands, the working hands, the ones her father had always said were her best feature. "I'd rather be useful." May looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and produced a small cloth sack. "I've got dried apple rings in here, half a block of cheese, and some jerked venison left from winter. Don't argue. It's traveling food." Clara almost smiled. "Someone gave me traveling food recently." "Good. Then you know how to accept it." She left for Rowan's orchard the next morning. The road north was familiar from her walk 2 days prior, but different in daylight. The fields on either side showing the early green of things deciding to grow. The sky wide and pale and cold in the way of Kansas spring mornings that hadn't quite committed to warmth yet. She walked it in her work boots, her father's old canvas bag over one shoulder carrying the tools she'd managed to salvage before the Halverson brothers took everything. A hive tool, a pair of worn leather gloves, a smoker that needed a new bellows but could be made to work. Small things. The core of what you needed if you knew what you were doing. She arrived at the Rowan place just before 8 o'clock and stood at the gate for a moment looking at it in the morning light. It was a working farm in the sense that it had all the parts: the house, solid and plain, the barn, a few outbuildings, fencing that had been good once and was now somewhere between maintained and neglected. The orchard itself spread south and east of the house, maybe 12 acres of apple trees arranged in rows that someone had laid out carefully, long ago, with proper spacing and sightlines. The trees were old enough to be productive. They'd had time and sun and presumably reasonable soil. They were leafing out now with the indifference of trees that had been blooming for years without result, and had, if trees could be said to have such things, given up expecting anyone to notice. Elias Rowan came out of the barn before she reached the porch. He looked slightly startled to see her, which told her he hadn't been entirely sure she'd come. He was wearing a work jacket and had the look of a man who'd been up since before light, which, she would later learn, was simply his natural state. "Miss Wren," he said. "You said to come when I was ready," she said. "I'm ready." He studied her for a moment the way he'd studied her on the road, without the particular brand of pity she'd gotten used to receiving. It was more like he was taking inventory, not of her appearance, but of something less visible. Her steadiness, maybe. Whether she was going to break on him. "Coffee first," he said. "I'd rather see the hive sites." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. "Fair enough," he said. Come on then. He walked her through the orchard row by row, which took the better part of an hour, and she asked questions as they went, and he answered them honestly, which she noted. Some men, when they've been failing at something for long enough, develop a way of talking around the failure, a kind of defensive language that circles the problem without landing on it. Elias didn't do that. He said flatly that he'd tried everything his father had tried and some things his father hadn't, and none of it had made a measurable difference. He'd had a beekeeper from over in Saline County come look at it once, 3 years back, who'd said the soil was fine and the trees were fine, and he couldn't explain it. He'd kept 3 hives himself for a season before that, and lost them all to Varroa without knowing what Varroa was until it was too late. "Did your father keep bees?" she asked. "In the early years, before I was old enough to remember much. He let them go eventually, said they were more trouble than they were worth." He paused. "He was wrong about a lot of things, my father." She looked at him when he said that. The particular flatness in his voice, the way he said it without heat, the way you say something you've had years to make peace with but haven't entirely. She understood that register. She kept walking. By the time they'd finished the orchard, she knew what she thought. She stood at the south end of the last row, hands on her hips, looking back the way they'd come. "You've got water?" she said. "Creek on the east boundary. Runs clear. Clover in those fields to the north? Red and white both. Comes up every year whether I plant it or not. Good forage range then." She turned around slowly, orienting herself. "You've got the slope right. South-facing, good sun, protected from the north wind by that tree line. Your soil is fine. Your trees are healthy enough. They're just not producing because nobody's been finishing the job." She looked at him. "You've got 12 acres here, and I'd guess on a good year with proper pollination you could be pulling, 800 bushels? Maybe more if we push the soil a little." He was quiet for a moment. "We haven't seen 200 in 7 years. "I know, that's the bees, or the absence of them." She turned back to the trees. "You need at least 8 colonies to work an operation this size properly. 12 would be better. I'd want to start with 6 this spring if we can get the equipment, build up over summer, overwinter them right." She paused. "The old hive sites, where were they?" He led her to the eastern edge of the orchard, near the creek, where 4 wooden stands still stood in a rough line, weathered down to silver gray, empty for years. She crouched by one and examined the stand, the angle, the exposure. She stood and looked at the creek, the surrounding forage, the way the orchard opened out from here. "This is a good spot," she said. "Whoever chose it knew what they were doing." "My grandfather," he said. "He kept bees until he died." She nodded. That tracked. The knowledge skipping a generation, the way things did on frontier farms when there was too much to manage and not enough hands to manage it. "I can work with these stands. I'll need lumber for new hive bodies, hardware for frames, wax foundation if we can get it from the co-op in Junction City." She straightened up. "And I'll need to source the colonies. I know a man in Ellsworth who runs a reputable operation. He'll sell me nukes that are properly bred, not feral cutouts." Elias had been listening with the focused, slightly guarded attention of someone trying to track information they don't fully understand. "Nooks," he said. "Nucleus colonies. Small, established colonies with a laying queen. Better to start with than packages. Less die-off, faster build-up." She glanced at him. "I can explain it all as we go. You don't need to know everything at once." "I'd like to learn," he said, in a way that sounded like he meant it rather than like he was being polite. She looked at him steadily. "Then the terms. I work the apiary, I make all decisions about the bees, when to inspect, when to split, when to treat if we need to. I won't work by committee, and I won't argue about methods with someone who hasn't kept bees. What I will do is explain my reasoning whenever you ask." "That's fair," he said. "Wages. I'll need to know what you're offering." He named a figure. It wasn't generous, but it was honest. She could see in his face that it was approximately what the operation could bear right now, not an opening offer designed to be argued down. She thought about it. "Plus the room," she said. "I can't keep paying rent in town and travel out here every day." He hadn't offered that. She saw him think about it. Not reluctance exactly, more the processing of a thing he hadn't considered. "There's a room in the main house," he said carefully. "It was my sister's before she married and left. It's been empty for 3 years." "I'll need to see it," she said.
And I'll want it understood clearly by you and by whoever's going to talk about it in town that the arrangement is professional. I'm your apiarist, nothing else." "I understand," he said, without flinching or getting defensive about it, which she noted. "Then let's go look at the room." It was small. Her father's apiary office had been bigger, with a single window facing east that would give her morning light, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook behind the door. It smelled like dust and disuse and the faint ghost of someone who had grown up here and left. The window latch was broken, and there was a gap at the bottom of the door that would need plugging before winter. "I'll fix the latch," Elias said. "I'll plug the door," she said. "I know how." She moved in 3 days later. The weeks that followed were not graceful. That was the first thing she would want to be clear about later when people tried to make the story simpler than it was. The work was hard, and the start was ragged, and she made mistakes she hadn't expected to make. The first 2 nucleus colonies she installed absconded within 10 days, not because she'd done anything wrong, exactly, but because the old hive bodies had absorbed enough of the wrong smells over the years that the new colonies wanted nothing to do with them. She'd burned the worst of the old lumber and rebuilt, spending 3 evenings in the barn with Elias holding the lantern while she assembled new frames, her hands moving automatically through the work while she talked through what had gone wrong and what she should have checked first. "I should have inspected the wood more carefully before I installed them," she said. "I was in a hurry because the colonies were ready, and I thought the equipment was fine. It wasn't." Elias, who had been quiet throughout this explanation, said, "What do we do now?" "Order 2 more nukes from the man in Ellsworth. Give it 2 weeks. Do it right this time." He didn't say anything about the cost of losing 2 colonies and having to replace them. She appreciated that more than she could have articulated. She also got stung 3 times in the first week, twice on the right hand and once on the neck, where she'd been careless about tucking in her veil. The hand swellings were familiar and manageable. The neck sting was not. It swelled in a way that made swallowing uncomfortable for 2 days, and she spent those 2 days working anyway, slightly miserable, slightly swollen, moving through hive inspections with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been reminded that the work doesn't wait for you to feel better. "You should rest," Elias said on the second morning, coming out to the apiary to find her there despite everything. "I'm fine. Your neck looks like a gourd. It'll go down by tomorrow." He stood watching her for a moment. "Clara, the bees won't fly away if you rest one day." She kept working. She didn't answer him, which wasn't exactly polite, but he let it go. He was learning, she noticed, how to read when she needed to be argued with and when she needed to be left to her own methods. He was a quicker study than she'd expected. What she didn't tell him, what she didn't tell anyone, was that the work was keeping her sane. Not in an abstract way, but in a very literal, immediate way. The apiary demanded her attention completely, the way few things in her life had demanded it since her father got sick. You could not worry about what Gavin Mercer's new fiancée was wearing, or what the women at the Broken Hollow Ladies' Circle were saying about you while your hands were inside a hive and you were reading the brood pattern and tracking the queen's behavior. The bees required you to be present, or they punished you for it. That was, in its way, a mercy. It wasn't the absence of grief. The grief was still there. For her father, for the apiary, for the version of the future she'd let herself believe in before Gavin's letter. It didn't go away. It just had to wait its turn, coming at her mostly in the evenings, when the light went low and the bees had settled into the hives for the night, and she was sitting on the upturned crate she used as a workbench stool, recording the day's inspections in the ledger she'd bought from the dry goods store with her first week's wages. She wrote everything down. Hive population estimates, brood pattern quality, honey stores, queen status, forage conditions. It was what her father had taught her. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And it was what made the difference between knowing your bees and guessing about them. Elias started coming out to the apiary in the evenings sometimes, when his own work was done, and sitting on a fence rail nearby while she wrote. He didn't talk much during those sessions. Sometimes he asked a question about what she'd found that day. Sometimes he just sat there with his coffee going cold in his hand, watching the hives settle for the night. Once, about 3 weeks in, he said, "Do you miss it, the old apiary?" She looked up from the ledger. "Every day," she said. He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "My father's orchard used to be something," he said.
When I was young. Before it stopped, he turned his coffee cup in his hands. I dream about it sometimes. The way it was. So do I, she said. The way mine was. They sat with that for a minute, not trying to make it better, just letting it be what it was. Two people who'd each inherited a dream and then watched it break. It was the most honest conversation she'd had since May's kitchen table. By the end of April, 4 colonies were established and building well. She'd split one that was strong enough to risk it, giving her 5, and was already monitoring 2 others for swarm cells that might give her a 6th before June. The trees were in full bloom and the bees were working them. She could hear it from the house on mornings when the wind was right, that particular hum that was the whole sound of her childhood and her father's life's work rising from the orchard below. And she would sometimes stop in the middle of whatever she was doing and just listen. The town had not stopped talking, but it was talking about different things now. What it had seen was a woman destroyed. What it was starting to hear about, through Elias when he came in to buy supplies, through the occasional farmer who passed the North Road and looked over the fence, was an orchard that seemed to be doing something it hadn't done in 7 years. Clara didn't know about most of the town's revision yet. She was too busy to pay much attention to what the town thought. She was too busy watching the bees work the blossoms, counting brood frames, checking honey stores, and waking up every morning to do it again. That was enough. The first sign that something had changed came not from the trees themselves, but from a man named Denton Briggs, who ran the produce buying operation out of the old mill building on the south end of Broken Hollow, and who had not bothered to ride out to the Rowan place in 4 years, because 4 years of nothing had cured him of the habit. He came on a Tuesday morning in late July, unannounced, which was how Denton Briggs operated. He believed that announced visits gave people time to hide things, and he'd built a moderately successful buying business on the philosophy that what you saw when people weren't ready for you was the truth, and what you saw when they were ready was a performance. He rode his gray mare up the North Road and turned in at the Rowan gate and stopped. The orchard stopped him. He sat on his horse at the gate for a full minute before he dismounted, just looking. The trees were heavy in a way he hadn't seen on this property since Elias's father's time. Branches bent at angles that told you there was real weight on them, apples coming in dense clusters, the fruit already sizing up well for late July and still 6 weeks from proper harvest. And the sound of the place was different. He registered that before he could name it, some quality in the air above the trees, a living hum that the orchard hadn't had before. Elias found him standing at the gate. "Briggs," he said. "Rowan." Denton Briggs was a short man with a broad face and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had been promised things by farmers for 30 years. He looked from Elias to the orchard and back. "What did you do?" "Got some bees," Elias said. Briggs looked at him. "That's it?" "That's most of it." Briggs walked into the orchard without being invited, which was also how he operated, moving between the rows and reaching up now and then to turn a fruit in his hand, checking the size, the color, the firmness. He was not gentle with his assessments. He pulled a small knife from his vest pocket and cut into one apple and looked at the flesh and smelled it and touched it with his thumb. Clara came around the end of a row and stopped when she saw him. "Who's this?" she said to Elias. "Denton Briggs. He buys produce for resale to settlements east of here." Briggs turned at the sound of her voice. He looked at her with the same assessing look he'd given the apple. Not unkind exactly, but not interested in pretending he wasn't evaluating. "You're the beekeeper," he said. "I am," she said. "Walter Wren's girl." "His daughter, yes." Briggs nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a thing that confused him has become slightly less confusing. "I heard you'd come out here. Didn't believe it would amount to anything." He looked back at the trees. "I was wrong." Clara said nothing, because it wasn't a question. "What are you expecting at harvest?" he said, turning to Elias. "Honest number." Elias glanced at Clara because it was her honest number more than his. She said, "If the weather holds through August, and it looks like it will, I'd estimate 600 bushels. Maybe closer to 700 if the late varieties size up the way the early ones did." Briggs looked at her steadily. "Last year this place pulled 160. "I know," she said. She pecad. Another beat of silence. Briggs turned his knife over in his hand, a habit, not a threat. I want a first refusal agreement on the apple harvest, he said. Price at standard market rate, nothing fancy, but I want it in writing before anyone else comes sniffing around. He looked at Elias when he said this, but Elias looked at Clara, which Briggs noted with a slight adjustment of his expression. Not displeasure, just recalibration. He was a man who tracked where the actual decision-making lived. The honey too, Clara said. I don't usually deal in honey. You will when you see what we're pulling. We've got 7 colonies at peak summer strength, and we've had exceptional clover forage. The yield is going to be significant. She held his gaze. Honey keeps. It's not a perishable commodity like fruit. Merchants in Junction City are paying a good price right now, and they'll take everything we produce. If you want the apples, you take the honey. Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted toward what might have been respect. The grudging variety that only came from encountering someone who knew what they were doing. Fine, he said. Both. I'll have my man draw up the paperwork. He left within the hour, back down the north road on his gray mare, and Clara and Elias stood at the gate watching him go. That went well, Elias said carefully. He'll try to renegotiate at harvest, she said. Have the paperwork ready. Elias looked at her sideways. You always assume the worst about people? She thought about that honestly. I assume people act in their own interest, she said. It's not the same thing. She turned back toward the apiary. I'm going to do an inspection on Hive 4. I think she's building swarm cells, and if I don't split her this week, we'll lose half the colony. She was already walking. Behind her, she heard Elias say, I'll come watch. And she didn't answer, but she also didn't tell him not to. He had been doing that more, coming out to the apiary, not because there was anything practical he needed to know, but because he seemed to find something in it that he couldn't get elsewhere. She'd noticed the way he watched her work, not with the idle curiosity of someone killing time, but with the quality of attention a person gives something that matters to them. He asked good questions. They weren't always the questions she expected. Sometimes she was ready to explain propolis, and he asked something about the sound the bees made when they were disturbed versus when they were calm, or why a particular hive faced a different direction than the others. Questions that were trying to understand the thing as a whole rather than just its mechanics. She answered all of them, which surprised her slightly. She had never been a natural teacher. Her father had taught her by demonstration and repetition and the occasional sharp correction, not by explanation, and she'd absorbed knowledge the same way, through her hands and her observations rather than through language. But she found that explaining to Elias forced her to put things into words she'd always known only in her body, and the act of doing that sharpened something in her own understanding. The split on Hive 4 went smoothly, which meant it went only moderately wrong. She found the swarm cells she'd suspected, 2 of them capped and 1 still open, and in the process of separating frames, she lost track of the original queen for 20 minutes that aged her considerably before she found her on the underside of a frame she'd already inspected twice. The new split went into a hive body they'd assembled 2 evenings prior, positioned 20 feet from the parent colony with its entrance facing north to confuse the foragers into staying put. Elias had watched all of this from outside the veil zone, far enough back to stay out of the bee's flight path but close enough to see. When she finally set down her tools and pulled off her gloves, he said, You lost her for a while. I did, Claire said. You didn't panic. She looked at him. Panicking in a hive gets you stung. Still, he said, she started cleaning her hive tool, scraping the propolis into a jar she kept for the purpose. After a moment, she said, My father used to say the bees can smell fear. It's not entirely accurate. They respond to the carbon dioxide in your exhaled breath when you're agitated, among other things. But the core of it is true enough. You have to stay slow. If you can't stay slow on the outside, you at least have to figure out how to be slow on the inside. Elias was quiet for a moment. Do you manage that? Being slow on the inside? She thought about the 20 minutes she'd spent looking for the queen, the tight controlled breathing, the systematic going back over what she'd already checked. Sometimes, she said, I've gotten better at it. He nodded, and she had the feeling he was thinking about something other than bees, but she didn't ask what. The harvest, when it came in September, was 680 bushels of apples, better than anything the Rowan orchard had produced since Elias's grandfather's era, and the honey yield was 42 gallons from 7 hives, which was not a record by any measure, but was, for a first full season with a rebuilt apiary, A genuinely good number. Denton Briggs came with his wagon and his man with the paperwork, and he paid the agreed price without renegotiating, which meant he'd looked at those numbers and decided the relationship was worth more than the small advantage he might have scraped by pushing. Word moved the way word moved in a place like Broken Hollow. Not through any one conversation, but through the accumulated weight of many small ones. Briggs mentioned it to the men he dealt with in Junction City. A farmer whose land bordered Rowan's to the north noticed the trees and mentioned it at the feed store. May Tuttle heard 3 separate accounts in a single week from people stopping at the dry goods counter, each one slightly different in its details but consistent in its basic shape. Elias Rowan's dead orchard had come back, and the Wren girl had done it. The Wren girl. As if she were still the same person who'd walked out of that church in the spring. She heard herself described this way and felt something complicated about it. Not quite anger, not quite amusement, somewhere between the two. She was still Clara Wren. She hadn't changed her name or reinvented herself or done any of the dramatic things that stories tended to require of women who recovered from public humiliation. She had just gone to work. She had gotten up every morning and done the work that she knew how to do, and the work had done what work does when it's the right work in the right conditions. What had changed was harder to name. May came out to the orchard one Sunday in late September, the first time she'd made the trip, arriving with a basket of goods from the store and the look of a woman who had needed to see a thing with her own eyes before she fully believed it. She and Clara walked the orchard together while Elias was in town, and May looked at the stripped branches, the harvest done, the trees standing lighter now, and at the apiary where the 7 hives were pulling in the last of the fall forage and building their winter stores. And she was quiet for a long time. "Tell me how you are," she said finally. "Not the orchard, you." Clara considered the question seriously, the way May had always made her consider things. "Better," she said. "Not fixed. Better." "Is there a difference?" "Yeah," Clara said. "Fixed means it's done. Better means you're still in it, but it's moving in the right direction." May turned her head to look at her. "You look different." "I've been outdoors every day since April." "It's not that." May stopped walking and turned to face her. "Clara, you look like yourself again." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out at the trees, at the way the September light came through the thinning leaves at an angle that was already edging toward autumn's particular slant. She thought about who she'd been sitting on that rock beside the road in April. The flatness of it, the ground-out quality of a person who has exhausted their reserves. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she'd pulled the first frames of fully capped honey and held one up against the light and felt, for the first time in a year, something that was purely and uncomplicated glad. "Maybe," she said. May made a sound that meant she was choosing not to push it, which was one of the things Clara had always valued about her. Instead, she said, "People are talking differently about you now. I thought you should know." "Good differently or bad differently?" "Mostly just differently. Less like you're someone a thing happened to and more like you're someone who did a thing." May paused. "Ruth Perkins asked me if you'd consider teaching her daughter about bees. The girl's 12 and apparently won't stop talking about it." Clara looked at her sideways. "Somebody told a 12-year-old about bees?" "Somebody's 12-year-old apparently came out on the road past here a few weeks ago and watched you working for 20 minutes before she got caught and sent home." May's expression managed to be both disapproving and fond simultaneously. "Her name's Josie. She drew pictures of the hives when she got home. Ruth found them and thought, well, she thought you might be willing to talk to her." Clara was quiet. She was thinking about herself at 12, the first summer her father had let her do a full solo inspection, the specific quality of terror and wonder that had lived in her chest that afternoon. She thought about the 12-year-old version of herself now, looking at the life that version had lived and the losses it had accumulated. And she thought about what it might mean to put some of that knowledge into someone else's hands while it was still worth something. "Send her out on a Saturday," she said. "She'll have to stay well back the first time, until I know if she's calm around them." May nodded carefully, as if she was afraid that agreeing too enthusiastically would make Clara take it back. What neither of them said, what didn't need saying, was that this was the first time Clara had offered to give something to someone since April. The first time she'd had enough to give. In mid-October, after the second cutting of honey and before the hives were wrapped for winter, Clara came in from the apiary in the early evening to find Elias sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger she kept for the operations accounts. Not her inspection ledger, the financial one. He'd been going through the numbers. She stopped in the doorway. "I knocked your mud off outside," she said, by way of indicating she'd noticed what he was doing.
He looked up. "The books are good," he said. "Better than good." "I know." "The honey alone." "I know, Elias." He set the ledger down. "You knew before harvest what these numbers would look like." "I had a reasonable idea, yes." He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't tell me. Because you would have started planning around numbers that weren't real yet, and I've seen what happens to farmers who spend projected income in their heads before the harvest's in." She came the rest of the way into the kitchen and set her gloves and smoker on the shelf by the door. "Now it's in. Now you can look at the numbers." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to be irritated at being managed and concluding that she hadn't been wrong to do it. "There's enough to buy 6 more hive bodies before spring," he said. "Build up to 12 or 13 colonies, and refence the east field. I've been putting that off for 2 years. The hive bodies first," she said. "The fence can wait 1 more season if you manage the cattle right." "And if I don't want to manage the cattle that carefully?" She looked at him. "Then fence first and expand the apiary the following spring. It's your land. They're your decisions." "They're your bees," he said. "They're yours too," she said, and then something about the way she'd said it without thinking made her go slightly still. She turned toward the shelf and busied herself with checking the smoker's fuel, which didn't need checking. Elias said carefully, "Clara." "The hive bodies," she said. "I'll write to the man in Ellsworth before the month is out. He'll need the order before winter if we want spring delivery." A pause. "All right," he said. She heard him close the ledger. She heard the chair scrape back as he stood. She didn't turn around, and he didn't push it, and the moment passed the way moments did on the frontier, absorbed into the work and the season and the business of being 2 people who had learned, gradually and imperfectly, how to occupy the same space without requiring anything of each other that the other wasn't ready to give. Outside, the last light was going from the sky, and the bees had long since settled into their hives. The orchard stood quiet in the October dark, branches empty now of fruit, but no longer empty in the way they had been before. Not the emptiness of failure, but the emptiness of a thing that had given what it had and was resting, gathering itself for the next year, already carrying in its wood and roots the memory of what a full season felt like. Clara wrote the letter to Ellsworth that night, sitting at the small desk in her east-facing room with the window latch Elias had fixed back in April, holding firm against the October wind. She wrote a clear, business-like order for 6 nucleus colonies to be delivered at first bloom. She listed her specifications for the queens. Local bred, if possible, proven layers, gentle stock. She folded it and addressed it and set it by the door to take to town in the morning. Then she sat for a while at the desk, not writing, just listening to the wind against the window and the distant, barely audible sound of the farm settling into its night quiet. She thought about Josie Perkins, who was 12 years old and drew pictures of hives she'd only seen from a distance. She thought about her father's hands, showing her how to hold a frame. She thought about 6 more colonies in spring and what 12 hives could do to an orchard that was already finding its way back. She blew out the candle. She slept well, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. The County Harvest Festival had been running for 11 years, which was long enough to have developed its own traditions and its own politics and its own particular cast of people who cared too much about who got which booth placement along the main street. Clara had not attended the previous year's festival. She'd had no reason to. She'd been 3 weeks into her tenure at the feed store room, still raw from the apiary's loss, still navigating the specific humiliation of being the woman everyone in town had watched get abandoned at the altar. Festivals required a certain minimum reserve of dignity, and hers had been running too low. This year was different. Elias had suggested she bring the honey, said it mildly over breakfast one morning in early October, as if it were an obvious practical matter, which in some ways it was. They had product to move. Denton Briggs had taken his contracted portion, but there were 14 gallons remaining after his cut, and the festival drew buyers from 3 counties who would pay retail prices rather than Briggs's wholesale rate. It made financial sense. Clara knew it made financial sense. She also knew that walking into Broken Hollow's harvest festival as the woman from the Rowan orchard was a different thing entirely from the woman who'd slipped out of this town's awareness for the better part of a year. She would be visible. People would look and compare and draw conclusions, the way they always did, the way she'd stopped being able to stop them from doing. She went anyway. She and Elias loaded the wagon the morning of the festival. 14 gallons of honey in clay-sealed jars, the labels written in Clara's handwriting because Elias's handwriting was, as he freely admitted, nearly illegible, plus 2 bushels of the best late variety apples they'd held back from Briggs for exactly this purpose. Josie Perkins, who had been coming out to the orchard on Saturdays for 6 weeks now, and had graduated from standing at a safe distance to standing at a less safe distance, had asked to come and been granted permission by her mother, on the condition that she didn't touch anything she wasn't told she could touch, which was more or less the same condition Clara had placed on her from the beginning. Josie was 12 years old and had the focused intensity of a child who has found the thing and knows it, which Clara recognized from the inside and found both gratifying and slightly alarming to witness from the outside. She sat in the wagon bed beside a crate of honey jars for the ride into town, asking questions about winter cluster formation that were more sophisticated than Clara had expected, and Clara answered them in full, which meant they arrived at the festival considerably better informed on apian thermoregulation than anyone else there. The booth they'd been assigned was on the west side of the main street, between the Hendersons' vegetable stand and a woman from out near the county line who made soap and dipped candles. It was a decent spot. Shade in the afternoon, good foot traffic. Clara set up the honey display herself, arranging the jars by variety, the clover honey pale and clear, the late summer wildflower darker and more complex, a smaller number of jars from the linden trees at the orchard's edge that had a particular flavor she'd never been entirely able to describe, except to say it tasted like the hour before a summer storm. By mid-morning, the booth had drawn steady interest, more than Clara had anticipated. Part of it was the product. Honey was honey, always in demand. But part of it was curiosity. She understood that clearly enough. People came to buy and stayed to look. Some of them she recognized from the church in the spring, and she met their eyes without flinching, answered their questions about the honey without excessive warmth or coldness, made change correctly, and moved on to the next customer. May came by in the late morning and stood at the edge of the booth for a few minutes, not buying anything because she'd already been given 2 jars at cost, just watching. "How's it going?" she asked. "We've moved half the clover already," Clara said. "I meant you." Same answer. Clara accepted payment from a woman she didn't recognize and wrapped the jar in cloth. "It's fine, May. People are being civil." "Most of them," May said, with the precision of someone who has observed exceptions. "All of them so far," Clara said. She glanced at May. "What?" "Nothing." May looked down the street. "Elias is over talking to the hardware man. He's been there a while. He's probably looking at fencing." "Probably." But May had a quality in her voice that Clara had learned to associate with information she was deciding whether to deliver. "May, I heard something this morning," May said, "from Cabe Stanton, so treat it accordingly. You know how Cabe hears things." She paused. "He said Gavin Mercer is in town today." The name landed the way it always did. Not as pain anymore exactly, but as a specific kind of alertness, the same way a healed-over scar tightens in cold weather. Not the original wound, the memory of it. Clara set down the jar she was holding. "His engagement fell through," May said. "The Forsyth girl's family. Apparently the father decided Gavin's family's grain business wasn't as solid as advertised, and the whole arrangement collapsed sometime over the summer." She looked at Clara carefully. "I'm telling you so you're not caught off guard." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at Josie, who was on the other side of the booth, explaining to a boy roughly her age why bees fanned the hive entrance, with an authority that would have been funny if it hadn't been so accurate. "Thank you," Clara said. "Do you want to—" "No," Clara said. "I'm going to stay at the booth and sell honey." May nodded. "All right." She squeezed Clara's arm once, brief and firm, and moved on down the street. Clara sold 3 more jars of wildflower honey in the next 20 minutes. She answered questions about crystallization and why it happened and how to liquefy it back without ruining it. A man from 2 counties east asked about buying in quantity for his general store,
and she took his information and told him she'd send prices before the end of the month. She was in the middle of explaining the difference between extracted and comb honey to an elderly woman who seemed determined to understand the full process before committing to a purchase, when she became aware of a shift in the ambient quality of the crowd nearby, the way a crowd shifts when someone walks through it who changes the social atmosphere. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her explanation, made the sale, wrapped the jar, said goodbye. Then she looked up. Gavin Mercer was standing 12 feet away. He looked. She cataloged this in the flat, observational way she'd learned to catalog hive conditions, like a man who had expected something to happen differently than it was happening. He was dressed better than the occasion required, which had always been a habit of his, and he was smiling in the practiced way of someone who has prepared a smile in advance and is now deploying it. He was also, she noted, alone. No family, no friends positioned strategically nearby. Just him, standing in the middle of the harvest festival on a Saturday morning, looking at her across a table of honey jars. She waited. "Clara?" he said. He stepped closer. "You look well?" "Gavin," she said. Her voice came out even, which was what she'd wanted. "I heard you'd set up out at the Rowan place." He glanced at the booth, at the honey jars, at Josie, who had stopped talking to the boy, and was watching him with the frank stare of a 12-year-old who doesn't know she's supposed to pretend not to. "Looks like things have worked out for you." "They have," Clara said. "I'm glad." He said this with the warmth of a man who wants credit for being glad. I've wondered how you were getting on." She looked at him and said nothing, because nothing was the accurate response. He moved closer to the booth, dropping his voice slightly in the way of a man trying to make a public encounter feel private. "I know things ended badly between us," he said. Badly. As if bad weather had intervened, as if the letter and the boy and the crowded church had been something that happened to both of them equally. "I made choices I'm not proud of." "All right," she said. He blinked. Apparently he'd expected more than that. "I mean it, Clara. I handled things poorly. You deserved better than—" He gestured vaguely, which she supposed was as close as he could come to naming what he'd actually done. "I should have spoken to you myself." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I've had time to think about it." He put both hands on the edge of the booth table, leaning in slightly. The smile had shifted into something more earnest, or what was trying to be earnest. "You've done something remarkable out here. Everyone's talking about it. And I hoped, that maybe we could start over, have a real conversation." The street had gone oddly quiet around their booth, in the way of a crowd that is collectively pretending not to listen while listening intently. Clara was aware of this. She was aware of Josie frozen on her side of the table, aware of movement at the edge of her vision that might have been May, or might have been someone else entirely, aware of the fact that a significant number of people who had watched what happened in the church last spring were now watching what happened here. She set down the jar she was holding, she straightened up, and she felt in that moment something clarify inside her. Not anger, not triumph, but something quieter and more complete than either. The thing she'd been building since April, hive body by hive body, inspection by inspection, season by season. She knew who she was now. She knew what she'd made and what she was capable of making. And she could see Gavin Mercer very clearly, not as the man she'd agreed to marry out of desperation and a thin hope, but as what he'd always been. A man who measured people by what they were worth to him at a given moment. "Gavin," she said, "I'm going to say this once and I'm not going to say it unkindly, because I don't need to be unkind to tell the truth." She kept her voice at a normal volume. She was not going to whisper. "You didn't want me last spring. You wanted security, and you decided I didn't represent enough of it, and you sent a 14-year-old boy to tell me that in a church full of people." She paused. "That's what happened. I'm not going to call it anything softer." He started to say something. She continued, "What I want you to hear, and I mean this with no bitterness, because I've worked too hard this year to carry bitterness into the next one, is that losing you was the best thing that happened to me. Not because of what I found instead, though what I found was better than anything you were offering. Because of what I found in myself when everything else fell apart." The crowd nearby had stopped pretending. There was no ambient noise masking what she was saying. There were people 3 booths down who were no longer interested in their own transactions.
Gavin's face had gone through several transitions. The prepared smile, then discomfort, then something that might have been genuine shame, though she couldn't be certain it wasn't just embarrassment at the audience. "I don't want to start over," she said. "I'm not interested in a conversation. I have honey to sell and customers waiting, and I have a lot of work to get back to that actually matters to me." She looked at him steadily. "I hope things go better for you, I mean that, but I need you to understand that I'm done with whatever this was, and there's nothing here for you." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then old Cabe Stanton, who was standing 6 feet to the left with a jar of honey he'd been intending to buy, said, in the particular way that meant he was satisfied with what he'd witnessed, and that single syllable seemed to break whatever had been holding the crowd in suspended animation. There was not applause exactly. There were voices coming back, a general returning of attention to the normal business of the festival, several people shifting and moving as if releasing breath they'd been holding. A woman whose name Clara didn't know caught her eye and gave her a nod. Small, direct, the same kind old Cabe Stanton had given her in the church. Gavin stood at her booth for another moment. The prepared smile was entirely gone now, replaced by a plain expression that was, she thought, probably closer to his actual face than anything she'd seen on him in the time she'd known him. He looked like a man who had come expecting a door to open and instead had found a wall. Not a cruel wall, just an undeniable one. He said, "Take care of yourself, Clara," and his voice for once didn't have any performance in it. "I am," she said. "That's the point." He walked away down the festival street and didn't look back, and the crowd absorbed him and moved on. And Clara turned back to her booth and found Josie staring at her with an expression of unconcealed awe that was simultaneously touching and faintly embarrassing. "What?" Clara said. "Nothing," Josie said. Then, "How did you do that?" "Do what?" Not fall apart or yell or anything. Just say it like that." Clara picked up the jar she'd set down and began reorganizing the display, which had gotten slightly disrupted during the exchange. "Practice," she said, "and having something to go back to." She handed Josie a cloth. "Wipe down the table edge. Someone put their hands on it." Josie did as she was told, still watching Clara sideways. "Something to go back to," she repeated, chewing on it. "When you know what matters to you," Clara said, "other things stop mattering as much. It doesn't happen all at once, but it happens." She moved a jar of linden honey to better light. "Hand me the wildflower jars from the back crate." Josie handed them over. Elias appeared at the edge of the booth sometime in the next 10 minutes. She wasn't certain exactly when, only that at some point she looked up and he was there, leaning against the booth post with his arms crossed, watching her help a customer. He didn't have the expression of a man who'd just heard what had happened and was checking on her. He had the expression of a man who had heard what had happened and already knew she was fine. When the customer left, he said, "Cabe Stanton is telling the full account to anyone who'll stand still long enough." "Of course he is," Clara said. "His version has you a little taller and Gavin a little shorter than the reality probably was. That's how Cabe's versions always go." Elias was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the linden honey jars and turned it in his hand, looking at the color of it against the light. "You all right?" he said. "I'm better than all right," she said, and meant it. He set the jar down. He didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right. He stayed at the booth for the rest of the afternoon, not selling. She was better at the selling than he was, and they both understood this, but present in the way that meant something without requiring a name. When a man from the eastern settlements got pushy about pricing, Elias straightened up from where he'd been leaning and looked at him with the quiet, absolute patience of someone who has farmed hard land and buried a father and started over and is not going to be moved. And the man reconsidered his approach. By late afternoon, all 14 gallons of honey were gone. The apples were mostly gone. Josie had fallen asleep sitting upright against a post, which seemed physically improbable but was happening nonetheless. Loading the empty crates into the wagon, Clara looked out at the festival street in the last warm light of the October afternoon. The crowd thinning now, the day's business mostly done, lanterns beginning to be lit against the approaching dark. She thought about the spring, about the church, and the letter, and the road, and the rock beside it, and the flat, unbottomed feeling of sitting there in a ruined dress with no plan and no direction. She thought about 7 hives full of bees going into winter fat and ready.
She thought about Josie Perkins, asleep against a post, who was going to be somebody's finest beekeeper someday. She helped Elias with the last of the crates and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Josie woke up enough to scramble into the back. And they drove north out of town in the early dark, with the lantern swinging on its hook and the horse moving at the easy pace of an animal that knows it's going home. Clara didn't look back at Broken Hollow as they left it. She was already thinking about the spring. The 6 nucleus colonies from Ellsworth arrived on the 3rd Thursday of April, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Clara had walked out of a church in a borrowed dress and sat down beside a road with nowhere particular to go. The man who delivered them was named Pruitt, a wiry, sun-darkened beekeeper in his 60s who had been selling colonies across 3 counties for longer than Clara had been alive, and who assessed her apiary setup with the careful, unsentimental eye of someone who had seen many operations and maintained strong opinions about all of them. He walked the hive line slowly, looking at her established colonies from the previous year. 7 of them, wintered successfully, all 7, which was not a given and was in fact better than the territory average. And he pulled on his ear and squinted and finally said, "Your brood boxes are a little close together." 6 inches closer than standard, Clara said. "I've been monitoring for drift. It's not a problem with this layout." Pruitt looked at her sideways. "You Walter Wren's girl?" "His daughter, yes. He used to do the same thing with his layout. Said it reduced robbing behavior in late summer." He paused. "He was right about that." "I know," she said. "He taught me." Pruitt looked at the hives for another moment, and then he helped her unload the nucleus colonies without further criticism, which she took as the highest compliment available from a man of his disposition. Elias carried boxes and held things when asked and stayed out of the way when not asked, which had become his reliable operating mode around the apiary, useful without being underfoot, present without performing. By noon, the 6 new colonies were installed, entrances reduced for the first week, water sources positioned. 13 hives in total now, stretched along the east boundary of the orchard, where the morning sun hit them first. Clara stood at the end of the line, looking at them the way you look at something you've been building toward for a long time. Not with satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction was too finished a feeling, and this was nowhere near finished. But with something that recognized the distance traveled. Pruitt accepted coffee in the kitchen before he left and said to Elias, gesturing at Clara with his cup, "She knows what she's doing. Don't interfere with it." "I don't," Elias said. Pruitt looked between them once, the quick professional assessment of a man who has sat in a lot of kitchens and learned to read what's in them. He didn't say anything further. He drank his coffee, shook hands, and left. When the sound of his wagon had faded down the north road, Elias poured himself more coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the orchard, which was in its 2nd week of bloom. The trees heavy with white and pale pink flowers, the air above them already moving with the new colony's first exploratory foragers. 13, he said. 13, she agreed. Last year with 7 we pulled 680 in apples. This year we should be closer to 800, she said, assuming normal weather. He turned from the window. He had the careful look he sometimes got, the one that meant he was working up to something he hadn't decided yet how to say. She'd learned to recognize it. She also knew that pushing him produced worse results than waiting. She waited. "Clara," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as something it isn't." "All right." He set down his cup. "I have 40 acres in this property. The orchard's 12, the fields are another 20, and there's 8 acres on the north side I've never done anything useful with. Good soil, decent water access from the creek that runs north of the tree line." He paused. "I've been thinking about what it would mean to expand the apiary beyond what the orchard needs. Build something separate from the fruit operation. Its own thing." She looked at him. "A standalone apiary." "Your apiary," he said, "not mine. Built on this land, but built by you. For you. As yours." He picked up his cup again, seemed to realize he was just holding it, set it back down. "I know how to write a land agreement. My father taught me that much. You'd have full operational control, documented ownership of the colonies and the equipment, revenue rights on the honey independent of what the orchard earns." He stopped. "It's not charity. I've thought about the numbers. The operation would pay for itself inside of 2 seasons at the scale I'm picturing." She was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I'm not asking you to..." and stopped, tried again. This isn't about anything except the fact that you should have something that's yours, that belongs to you on paper, the way it already belongs to you in every way that matters. He looked at her directly. You've spent a year building something on my land, and you've been fair and professional about it, and I've been paying you wages that, if I'm honest, don't reflect what you've actually contributed. He said this last part with the directness of someone making an admission they've been sitting with for a while. I want to fix that. Clara looked at her hands on the table, the beekeeper's hands, her father's hands, the ones she'd been staring at her whole life. She thought about the Halverson brothers and their papers. She thought about what it meant to own something on paper, the way her father had owned the apiary on paper, and how paper could be taken. And if the operation fails, she said, if we have 2 bad winters, a disease that wipes out the colonies, then we figure out what we do next, he said, same as we've been doing. You can't promise me that. No, he said, but I can tell you it's what I intend. She looked at him. Elias Rowan, who had found her on a road and offered her purpose instead of pity, who had held lanterns in the dark while she rebuilt hive bodies, who had learned to sit quietly in an orchard at dusk and not need anything from it, who had lost his father's dream and spent 7 years failing at a version of it that wasn't quite his own before something changed, who was not a simple man, and not an uncomplicated man, and not a man without grief or flaw or the particular stubborn pride of someone who had been failing long enough to mistake it for his permanent condition. She had not let herself think carefully about what she felt about Elias Rowan. She had been deliberate about that. She had watched herself the way she watched new colonies, monitoring for signs of dependency, making sure what she felt was real rather than the artifact of gratitude or the misplaced attachment of a person with nowhere else to put their feelings. She knew that difference from the inside. She knew how loneliness could wear other emotions like a costume. But this was not that. She'd known for a while that this was not that. She just hadn't known what to do with the knowing. She said, I want a lawyer to draft the agreement, not just your father's method. He blinked. Then slowly, something that had been held carefully in his face relaxed. There's a man in Junction City. He's expensive, but he's thorough. Split the cost with me, she said. It's my agreement, too. All right. I want my name on the land parcel, not as a tenant agreement. Actual title. He looked at her steadily. Yes. That's going to make people talk. People already talk, he said. Let them find something accurate to say for once. She held his gaze for a moment. Elias? Yes. That's not all you wanted to ask me. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long, which was long enough for everything that lived in it to be understood by both of them without requiring further language. He looked at her with the plain, undefended expression she'd come to think of as his most honest face, the one without the careful management, without the caution of a man who had learned to hold things close. No, he said, it's not. Ask the rest of it, then. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. I've been trying to figure out when it would be fair to ask, he said, whether there was a right time. I didn't want to ask while you were still, he searched for the word, still in it, still coming back from everything. I didn't want you to say yes for the wrong reasons. I know, she said. Do you know what I'm asking? Elias, she said quietly, I've known what you were going to ask since approximately November. He stared at her. November. The evening you sat in the kitchen looking at the accounts. A long pause. That was before the harvest numbers were even fully in. I know. That was nearly 5 months ago. I know that too. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, more like the release of a long-held breath. And you've just been waiting? I needed to be sure that I wasn't saying yes to the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, she said. The way you needed to be sure you weren't asking at the wrong time. We were both waiting for the same thing. Which was? She thought about how to say it. For me to know that I want this because it's right, not because I need it. She looked at him. There's a difference. I know what the other version feels like. I agreed to a marriage once out of need and desperation and the absence of other options, and I've spent a year finding out what it costs you to make that kind of decision. She paused. This isn't that. He was very still. What is it then? It's a choice, she said. My choice. Made from solid ground. Outside, the orchard moved in a light wind, the blossoms throwing pale petals into the air, the way they would for only another week or two before the fruit set in and the showy part was done and the real work began. Through the kitchen window, the apiary was visible at the orchard's edge, 13 hives in a line, the air above them thick with the outgoing morning flight of 40,000 bees. Yes, she said. They married in June, 5 weeks before peak honey harvest, and 2 weeks after the Junction City lawyer finalized the land agreement that gave Clara documented title to the north 8 acres and operational ownership of every colony on the property. The timing was deliberate on her part. She wanted the paperwork done first, wanted to walk into the marriage already owning something, already standing on ground that was legally hers, so that whatever she was saying yes to afterward was chosen freely rather than accepted as a bundle. May Tuttle was there. Cabe Stanton was there. Denton Briggs came, which surprised her, and brought a decent bottle of whiskey, which surprised her less. Josie Perkins came with her mother Ruth, and Josie spent most of the small outdoor ceremony looking toward the apiary with the distracted devotion of someone who loves the place more than the occasion, which Clara understood perfectly. There was no church. They stood under the largest apple tree in the orchard, the one at the end of the second row that was oldest and widest and had, according to Elias, been planted by his grandfather the year he first broke the land. The ceremony was short, a justice of the peace from town, 2 witnesses. Words that meant what they were supposed to mean. Elias held her hand through most of it, which was not something they'd discussed, just something he did, and she didn't move her hand away. But the years that followed were not a fairy tale, and Clara would have been the first to say so. There were 2 winters that were harder than they should have been. The second one, they lost 4 colonies to a cold snap that came without warning in late January, and Clara spent 3 days being angry about it in the specific, unproductive way you're angry when you did everything right and the weather did something wrong anyway, before she ordered replacement colonies and rebuilt. There was a summer when apple scab moved through the county and took a third of the fruit, and they made up the deficit on honey revenue, but it was tight. There was a disagreement about fencing, specifically about whether the south fence needed replacing before the west fence, which seemed like a minor thing and was not, and which produced the worst argument of their marriage and 3 days of careful silence before Elias admitted she'd been right about the south fence, and she admitted she'd been more stubborn about being right than the situation required. They were 2 stubborn people with histories that had taught them different things about loss and trust and what it cost to let someone see you struggling. They were not always good at it. They got better, slowly, the way you get better at hard things, through repetition and failure and the occasional sharp recognition of your own worst habits. The apiary grew to 22 colonies by the 4th year. Clara added a proper extracting house on the north property with a stone foundation and cedar walls built in the late fall when she and Elias and 2 hired men had nothing else pressing, and it smelled from the day it opened like every extracting shed should smell: wax and honey and wood, and the particular sweetness of decades of good work conducted in a small space. Josie Perkins became her first real student, if you could call it that, though Clara never used the word formally. What happened was closer to an apprenticeship of attrition. Josie simply kept showing up every Saturday and then 3 days a week through the summers, asking questions and making mistakes and asking more questions, until somewhere in her 14th year she was doing colony inspections on her own, making calls Clara trusted, and teaching the occasional visiting farmer's child what she'd been taught. She had her mother's practicality and a fearlessness around the bees that Clara recognized as natural talent rather than recklessness, the rare kind of calm that couldn't be taught, only developed. "You're going to have your own operation someday," Clara told her, on one of those summer evenings when they were both sitting on upturned crates at the edge of the apiary writing in their respective ledgers. Josie didn't look up from her writing. "I know," she said, with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has already decided something and moved on. Then, "I want to run medicated sugar syrup on Hive 6 before winter. I think she's undermothered." "She's fine," Clara said. "Check her again in 2 weeks. If the population's still down, we'll reconsider." Josie wrote something in her ledger. "How do you know when you're ready?" she said, after a minute. "To have your own operation." Clara thought about the question honestly. "You don't know," she said. You just reach a point where you've learned enough that the not knowing doesn't paralyze you. You can be uncertain and still work. That's most of it, honestly. Learning to work while you're still uncertain. Josie turned that over. That applies to more than bees, she said, with the slightly unsettling directness of a teenager who has been paying attention to adult conversations for years. Most things do, Clara agreed. In her 6th year at the orchard, Clara started something she hadn't planned. A woman from town, a widow, recently arrived from Missouri with 2 daughters, and the shell-shocked quality of someone who has had the life she thought she was living abruptly dismantled, came out to the apiary to ask about buying honey and ended up staying for 3 hours, not buying anything, just talking while Clara worked through an inspection. Clara answered her questions about the bees and the questions underneath those questions, the ones about starting over and whether it was possible and what you did when the plan you'd been following disappeared and left you in an unfamiliar place without a map. She didn't offer wisdom. She wasn't built for wisdom. She just told the truth about what it had been like and let the woman listen. A month later, the woman came back and asked if she could learn the bees. She was not naturally gifted. She was slow with her hands and initially very frightened. And the first time she got stung, she sat down hard in the grass and looked like she might leave and never return. She didn't leave. She sat in the grass for 5 minutes and then got back up. And that, Clara had long since understood, was the whole of what it required. Not fearlessness, not perfect coordination, not some innate specialness, just the willingness to get back up and try the next thing. By the 2nd summer, she was maintaining 4 colonies of her own on the north property, paying for the privilege with labor on the extracting days, learning the way people learn when they need it to mean something. Word moved, the way it always moved in a territory like this, through the accumulated weight of small conversations. By Clara's 7th year, she had 5 women learning the bees from her, all of them different, all of them carrying different versions of the same story. Lives that had been pulled out from under them by loss or abandonment or circumstances that had never been in their control. She didn't think of it as charity, and she would not have tolerated anyone who called it that. It was practical knowledge transfer, the same thing her father had done with her, the same thing she'd have wanted someone to do with her. In those 3 months above the feed store, when her options had been narrowing and she hadn't known yet that a road north existed, she kept good notes on all of them, the same way she kept notes on the hives. Population growth, progress, setbacks, what they struggled with, what they were ready for. It turned out that running an apiary and teaching a person were not so different in their fundamental requirements. You had to pay attention. You had to resist the impulse to intervene when patience served better. And you had to know when something that looked like failure was actually development. Elias came out to the apiary one evening to find her sitting on her crate with the student ledger and her inspection ledger both open, a lantern between them because the light was going and she wasn't finished. He stood nearby for a minute, looking out at the hive line, 22 boxes, the evening flight settling, the sound of the colonies dropping into their night hum. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said. "What?"
The way this place used to sound when I was very young, before it went quiet. He was quiet himself for a moment. I used to think the silence meant the orchard was dying, but it was just empty, waiting. He looked at her. I didn't know what it was waiting for. She looked up from the ledger. The lantern light put warm shadows across his face and made the gray at his temples look silver rather than gray, and she thought about the man she'd met on a road, the inventory he'd done of her without pity, the traveling food, the honest terms, the 7 years of failure he'd carried without theater, the way he'd stood quietly at the harvest festival and let her handle her own business. She thought about what it meant to be seen that way, honestly, without the softening that people put on things when they were uncomfortable with the truth. "You knew something was missing," she said. "I just didn't know what it was." "That's the beginning of knowing," she said. "Most people don't get even that far." He came and sat on the second crate that was always there now, positioned next to hers. And she went back to her ledger and he sat with his coffee going cold in his hand, the way he always did, and the hives settled around them in the April dark. She thought about the letter. She still had it, folded to 8ths in the back of her inspection ledger from the first year. Not because she was preserving it or memorializing it, but because she'd put it there and it had stayed and she'd stopped taking it out. She didn't need to read it anymore. She knew what it said, and more importantly, she knew what it had cost and what it had opened, and she held both of those things without needing to rank them.
Her father had told her once, when she was 10 or 11, and grieving over a colony she'd lost to something she didn't yet understand. That loss was not an interruption of a beekeeper's life. It was the texture of it. The good years and the bad years were made of the same days. You kept the records, you learned what you could, you ordered new colonies in spring. She hadn't understood it then. She did now. Years later, many years, enough that the children she and Elias eventually had were old enough to ask real questions. Her youngest would come to her on an evening much like this one and say, "Mama, tell me about when you were young. Tell me about the wedding that didn't happen." And Clara would put down whatever she was working on. She would think about how to say it honestly, the way she tried to say most things. Not the softened version, not the story where it was all necessary suffering leading to a destined conclusion, because that wasn't the truth. The truth was messier and more human. She had been broken by it, genuinely broken, and she had not known how to be fixed, and she had found her way back not through grace or plan or certainty, but through work and stubbornness, and one road that happened to go north, and a man who asked what she needed and then waited. And then she would say what was true. "It was the worst day of my life," she would tell her child. And it was also eventually the first day of this one. Those two things can both be true at once. Most important things are more than one thing at once. Her child would think about this, the way children do when they're given something real instead of something comfortable. And Clara would look out at the orchard, the old apple tree at the end of the second row, the hive line along the eastern boundary, the extracting house with its cedar walls and its permanent sweet smell, the north field that was hers on paper and in practice and in every hour of work she'd put into it, and she would feel, not contentment exactly, because contentment was too still a word for a life that was still going and still hard and still uncertain in all the ways that honest lives remain uncertain. What she would feel was something more like recognition. This is mine. I made this. Not alone? Never alone. And she'd learned to say that clearly, to give credit where it was owed, to Elias and to May and to her father's hands showing her how to hold a frame. But also, mine. My hands. My knowledge. My choice. Made from solid ground. She would let her child sit with that for a moment. Then she would say, "All right, come help me close up the hives for the night. I'll show you what to look for." And they would go together into the evening, the mother and the child, toward the hive line and the last of the day's light. And the bees would be there, as they always were, busy and purposeful and entirely indifferent to the human stories unfolding around them, doing what they had always done, turning what the world offered into something that would keep.